All righty, everyone. Thank you for joining. I was waiting for our participant list to. There it is. It's 100. So we are ready to go. We have a critical mass. I know other folks may be joining in a little while, but thank you all for joining our training today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a quick logistical issue. If you come across any problems during the course of the training today, please chat in to our host, and she'll try to problem solve and address any issues that you might have on the technical side. You probably all are familiar with the chat feature, so you can also chat in any questions or comments that you have during the training today. Everyone will remain muted, but we will keep the chat open, and please feel free to chat in any questions or comments that you have during the course of the training. There's also a couple of planned chats today from our presenters, and so you'll have an opportunity to give us sort of your thoughts and share your thoughts and feedback as we go along, and then other comments and questions we'll hold until the end when we have Q&A. So on behalf of the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's, it's a two-part training, Fostering Resilience, How to Build Bounce-Back Kids, Families, and Organizations. My name is Jim Rodriguez, and I'm the Director of Trauma-Informed Services at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research and the CTEC. And our presenter today is Dr. Nan Henderson of Resiliency in Action. And it's an organization dedicated to increasing knowledge and awareness about resiliency, and also the practice of building resilience. She's the author of a number of publications on resilience, including Resiliency in Action, Practical Ideas for Overcoming Risks and Building Strengths in Youth, Family, and Communities. And Dr. Henderson is joined today by Stefanie Miller. Stefanie is the coordinator for Building Resilience in Essex Families, or BRIEF. It's a coalition of agencies and organizations that have dedicated themselves to adopting Dr. Henderson's framework in the system of care in Essex County. It's part of the system of care of Essex County. And Stefanie will be talking about how what she's done in terms of translating and using that work in the community, in the system of care work that they're doing in Essex County. With all that said, I'd like to turn it over to Nan to start us off. Thank you, Dr. Henderson.
Well, good morning. Oh, well, actually, it's morning here. I'm on the West Coast. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so thrilled that you are joining us and that I get to share with you my life's work. And let me just start by saying that when I got my MSW many years ago at the University of Washington, there was no discussion of resilience or resiliency. The word was not being used at all. What people talked about at that time was at risk, high risk, nothing in the discussion about how people bounce back, about how we solve the problems of risk, about how we help people navigate risk. It was all about how awful it was. And so I was in my mid-30s and I had this nagging intuition that something was wrong with this picture. I went into social work to be able to help people, to help them feel better, to help them lead healthier lives. And all we did was talk about their risk and their stress. And we weren't even using the word trauma then. So lo and behold, in the course of my career, I was hired by Albuquerque Public Schools, and this was many years ago, to find the latest in the research that was coming out about how to help kids at risk. Again, the only topic, the only conversation was risk. And just bubbling out of the academic literature several decades ago was the concept of resiliency. It wasn't being talked about. You never heard the word. I know it's hard to believe because it's everywhere now, but you never heard the word. And I grabbed onto it. And a group of pioneering, kind of radical, primarily psychologists were saying, wait a second, people are more than their risk. People are more than their wounds. People are more than what's wrong with them. And there were several longitudinal studies that had been conducted for decades that were showing this innate ability to bounce back. And this whole idea of bouncing back and overcoming and resilience started to snowball. So that a few decades later, as you all know, we hear about it constantly. The word is used everywhere. So what I want to start by saying, what I'm going to share with you today is all based on social science research. I read a lot about resilience this, resilience that, and some of it's just philosophy. Some of it's people's bright ideas. And that's fine. It's great that we're now discussing it, but I want to take us back to what the actual social science research says that we can do as clinicians to help people who come to see us overcome whatever their stress, their adversity, and now we use the word trauma. So I'm going to talk about this body of research. It continues to grow. When I first found it a few decades ago, it was primarily focused on how children and youth overcome risk and adversity. Now there's resilience research going on related to every possible group. So you'll see studies about resilience in terminal illness, resilience in the elderly, resilience with the unhoused population, resilience this, resilience that. But the basis of the research really started looking at children and youth. And what I love about the best of the resiliency research is it's longitudinal. And what that means is it's followed people over time. The problem with risk research is that it's a snapshot. So if I'm a risk researcher, I go in there and I take a snapshot one day. How many people have this problem? How many people are substance abusers? How many people are engaging in unsafe sex? How many people are skipping school? How many people? And it's a snapshot. What it doesn't show is the bounce back process. A lot of those people will bounce back, and a lot of people have already bounced back. So the gold standard for research that should inform us, in my opinion, is longitudinal research. And much of the resiliency research is longitudinal over time, documenting the power to bounce back. So I've titled my presentation to you, How to Build Bounce Back Kids, Families, and Organizations. And I want to emphasize that resiliency research, amazingly enough, is applicable across the lifespan and across adversity. As I have studied hundreds of research outcomes, what I have found and what others have concluded is that the same factors will help a young person struggling to stay in school, will help an addicted person, will help a homeless family, will help an elder that perhaps is feeling isolated and lonely. The very same factors that I'm going to share with you are applicable across the lifespan and across adversity in terms of how people bounce back. So what I'm going to share with you, you can take to whatever population you're working with. You can take it to 5-year-olds, you can take it to 25-year-olds, you can take it to 85-year-olds, you can take it to entire families. And it really is a documentation of the bounce back process. So what are we going to be looking at today? We're going to look at exactly what is resiliency and why is it important today more than ever. And again, I'm going to rely on scientific definitions. And that's what I want to take us back to. So that's what I'll be sharing with you. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about fostering resiliency related to the most recent research on adverse childhood experiences. I'm going to share with you exactly how resiliency happens according to social science research. How does resiliency connect to prevention, to intervention, and of course, to the therapeutic work that you are doing? We're going to do a process called the resiliency chart. that you can use with any of your clients. We're going to look at a model I've developed called the Resiliency Wheel that has been utilized far and wide around the US and in other countries as a model of what our resiliency practice should look like. We're going to emphasize how can you foster resiliency in individuals, families. I'm going to touch on building resilient organizations. I'm going to share with you the resiliency quiz, and I'm going to emphasize throughout the presentation the power of one person to change a life. Now, let me just say something about that as an introduction. Over and over again, when researchers have asked people how they have bounced back, the power of one person comes up as a research finding. And it's an amazing phenomenon that really is empowering to all of us. So people will talk about a pivotal teacher, a pivotal minister. Often it's a neighbor, but it can also be, I've had people tell me it was their parole officer. It was the bus driver. It was any number of unsung heroes that just care and extend that caring, particularly to kids and youth, and they become one person, the power of one person. So when I was practicing in an agency as a social worker years ago, I used to say to myself, what good am I? I'm only one person. And I was working with teenagers in very difficult situations. And I looked at their family dysfunction, and I looked at the addiction, and I looked at the poverty, and I looked at the crime. And I said to myself, what good am I? And the resiliency research absolutely challenges that. We all have more power than we give ourselves credit for. So one of my goals for our time together is for you to feel validated that you're doing some things right, and you will feel validated. And also for you to feel empowered that you have more impact than you know. So let's start with the definition of resiliency. And you'll notice that I've titled this slide, Unlocking the Power of Resiliency. And the reason that I've titled this slide this way is because there is a power within everyone to bounce back. That's what this body of longitudinal, primarily research from psychology, but also psychiatry and sociology, has documented the power in each person to bounce back. But here's our challenge. If we don't look for resiliency, we won't see resiliency. So part of unlocking the power of resiliency is to develop the eyes to see it. And we may see it only as a flicker. And so our job then as practitioners or educators or counselors is to grow that flicker, to see it as like a pilot light. And we're going to utilize the very specific strategies from the body of resiliency research to help that power grow. So here's how I've defined resiliency from, again, the body of resiliency research that I've been reviewing for decades. It's defined as the capacity to bounce back, spring back, rebound, and successfully adapt in the face of adversity. Now, people need to develop social, academic, or vocational competence in that process, despite exposure to severe stress or simply the stress of today's world. What I realized along the way, and I've given thousands of presentations and written several books on the topic of bouncing back and resiliency. And what I realized along the way is that every single person alive encounters stress and trauma and adversity in our lives. And so what I'm going to be sharing with you, and this is also documented by research that I'll share, is really strategies for everyone. Now, obviously, many of your clients, many of the folks you're working with have some of the greatest adversity. So this is extremely applicable to them. However, as I've just said, all of us encounter adversity. You can't go through a day in this life and not encounter some level of adversity. And so these strategies are for all of us to help us encounter and successfully navigate the stress of today's world. What researchers have concluded is that there is within everybody an innate self-writing and transcending ability. Now that's a mouthful, but I love it. I love this concept that born within each person is this capacity to bounce back. And unfortunately, all these years later, after I found the concept of resiliency, this is still kind of a radical statement, because since the risk research, then we've had all the research on trauma, and that's a good thing. And then we've had research on adverse childhood experiences, and that's a good thing. But the lens through which we look at people, in my opinion, is still too focused on everything that's wrong and hasn't yet integrated this capacity to bounce back. So again, it was a group of pioneering psychologists, primarily looking over many decades, that concluded that there is within all of us an innate self-writing and transcending ability. It's within all the kids, the youth, the adults, organizations, within communities, within families. We are hardwired to bounce back. And think about it. We are hardwired to bounce back. As I've just said, we can't go through a day, any of us, without having to bounce back from something. We lost the car keys. We couldn't get the we couldn't get the Zoom to work correctly. The alarm didn't go off. Our cell phone is acting up. I mean, those are tiny, tiny little things that all of us encounter all the time. And then, of course, your clientele is encountering enormous adversity. But if we go into our practice with this attitude that we're hardwired to bounce back, it will serve us well. It will serve our clients well. It will help us to be more effective resiliency builders. We are hardwired to bounce back. So what I challenge everyone to do is to develop a new set of eyes. And perhaps you already are working with this set of eyes, but most of us need to develop more clearly this ability to see these little pieces of evidence that the people we're working with do have resiliency. They do have an ability to bounce back, maybe not in the dramatic, immediate ways that we would hope, but in little tiny ways, there is the evidence, and we need to be able to see it. Because one of the ways to unlock the power of resiliency is to see resiliency, and then to start mirroring that back to those that we're working with. How does resiliency happen? That's what people always ask me at this point in my training. Okay. You know, we understand there's resiliency and we understand there's all this research. How does resiliency happen? And the short answer is resiliency happens because of protective factors. So I'm going to be quoting some iconic resiliency researchers that really were pioneers in this paradigm shift that happened over the past decades. And one of them is Dr. Richard Jesser. Dr. Jesser was at the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado. And Dr. Jesser wrote very succinctly and very specifically about protective factors. So again, when somebody asks me, how does resiliency happen? The short answer is resiliency happens because of protective factors. If there was one word that I could wave a magic wand and integrate into our common vernacular, it would be, well, actually two words, one term, two words, protective factors, protective factors. We need to always be looking not just at the risk factors, the adversity, the adverse experiences, factors, but at the protective factors. It's one big picture. And how do people bounce back? They bounce back because of protective factors. So here's what Dr. Jesser wrote. Many adolescents, and he did focus on adolescents, many adolescents, and I would encourage you then to think in terms of children or adults or families who seem to be at high risk. Again, that was the terminology way back when. Now we could say who seem to have a lot of trauma, who seem to be experiencing a lot of adversity. Nevertheless, do not succumb to risk behavior or get less involved in than that their peers, or seem to abandon it more rapidly than others do. A likely answer as to why this is true, and what he's talking about, is why people who are encountering lots of adversity don't take that slide down into dysfunction and all the diagnoses that you work with every day, is that there was exposure to an experience of risk, stress, adversity, trauma. But that exposure was countered by exposure to an experience of protection. Protective factors: moderate, buffer, insulate against, and thereby do mitigate the impact of risk or stress or trauma on human development. So what Dr. Jesser and on all the resiliency researchers really have adopted the term protective factors. You may also hear the term resiliency factors, but the academic term is protective factors. What they're really saying is that the full picture is that, yes, people encounter enormous stress, enormous trauma, enormous adversity, and also there are these other factors that are going on in their lives that moderate, buffer, insulate against, and thereby to mitigate the impact of the risk. And that's how resiliency happens. Our goal is not to feel overwhelmed or to discount our power in the face of those who come to us that are in seemingly hopeless situations. Our goal is to identify and build the protective factors. In other words, the resiliency building factors in people's lives. And of course, in order to do that, we have to see them. And still, all these years later, I don't feel there is enough emphasized about looking for these other factors. That is the complete picture. So when I got my MSW many years ago, of course, there was no discussion of protective factors. There's no discussion, as I've already said, of resilience. It was all about the adversity, the difficulty, the risks. But even decades later, even though the term is thrown around a lot, there still isn't, in my opinion, the in-depth understanding of what it is that helps people bounce back and be resilient. It's so much more than just, oh yeah, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. No. There are individual and environmental conditions that research has shown help people bounce back. So as we go through the rest of the presentation, I want you all to be thinking in two ways, certainly professionally, but also think personally. Many of us who are called to the helping professions have traversed a journey of great adversity ourselves. I'm certainly one of those people. And as I encountered the resiliency research, what I was able to do is identify how it is I came through enormous adversity as a child and a young adult and still wound up resilient. I never understood it. And yet this research has given me a very in-depth understanding. And in my case, it really was, first and foremost, the power of one person. So what we need to be asking as we're talking with our clients is who in their lives gives us what the resiliency research indicates helps people bounce back. So how does this happen? So I'm a social worker, first and foremost. I do have a doctorate, but in my heart of hearts, I identify myself as a social worker. I'll always be a social worker, and social workers are practical. So I want to make this really practical. And before I share with you that activity, let me just touch base, sharing the recent research from Dr. Ann Maston and Dr. Jay Barnes. And you will get a set of these slides, I understand. And so you will have this reference. I love Dr. Maston's work. Dr. Maston's at the University of Minnesota. And Dr. Maston is probably the first and foremost respected resiliency researcher at this point. And so she does these meta-analysis or these cumulative reports that brings a lot of research together. So what she wrote in this recent research report is that a wide range of adverse experiences have been studied under the rubric of resilience. So we're now looking, as I've mentioned, not just at childhood trauma, but we're looking at child neglect and abuse, yes, separation and loss, yes. But in addition to that, family, neighborhood violence, terror, war, natural disasters, poverty, hospitalization, many other kinds of adversity. Now, some studies are focused on one kind of traumatic experiences, such as rape or the loss of a parent. But others assess cumulative risk. And what you all know is that it's fairly rare for someone to present that just has one piece of adversity in their lives. Usually there's multiple negative life events. Singular adversities are rare because the most severe forms of adversity, especially in childhood, often reflect chronic, repeated, combined exposures to traumatic events or hardships. As a result, many of the studies of resilience include cumulative risk in some form. So it's very important as I go into this information in more depth that you understand that as resiliency research has gotten more sophisticated, it's looked more and more at cumulative risk. Let me say just a word about adverse childhood experiences. It's tremendous research because, again, it focuses the lens of the whole culture on how important it is that we look at those early experiences. And if we're in mental health, if we're in education, if we're in a faith community, if we're in a community organization, that we realize that those early childhood experiences are often behind behaviors and symptoms that we haven't fully understood before. So that's the good thing about ACEs. Again, my concern about the focus on ACEs is that there's still not enough focus in tandem on resiliency. So let me do a little personal disclosure here. When I first took that 10-question ACEs questionnaire, I realized growing up, I had 9 out of 10. So you're looking at someone who had, and listening to someone who had 9 out of 10 on the ACEs scale. It's extremely rare to have that many ACEs. We know that even a few can lead to some really difficult outcomes. However, whenever I've taken a resiliency quiz, and there's several out there, including one that I've developed, and I'll be sharing that with you later in our presentation, I also score at the very top. So I had an enormous amount of childhood adversity. And I also had enormous resiliency building factors, all in the same tapestry of my childhood. And here I am, decades later. I certainly have needed the therapy and needed the personal growth work and needed to work on my mental health and looking at this woundedness and various patterns, but I am a resilient person. I've lived a very healthy and a very happy life in many ways. So just because somebody presents with 3 or 6 or 9 on that ACEs questionnaire does not mean that they don't have a positive future. And again, we have to look at the entire picture. So this next exercise is designed to help us do that. So I really hope everyone will do this, because you'll get the most out of what I'm sharing if you go through this activity. I want you to think about, and what this involves is pulling out a piece of paper. So I should say that first of all. Any scrap piece of paper is fine. And draw a line down the middle. And this is called the resiliency chart. And you can do this with yourself. You can do this with any person. You can do it with a family. You can do it with an organization. It's a wonderful tool to make the research practical, to make it something that you can look at and utilize immediately. So I want you to think about someone between the ages of 5 and 30. And I've chosen that age range because more resilience research has been done on children and youth than any other group. And I want you to write their name at the top of the page. So I'm going to talk about a hypothetical 6th grader named Sam. And on the left-hand side of the page, I want you to identify and to write down, again, just a word or two, the top 3 or 4 reasons that you're concerned about this person that you have named. Now, let me just share, I do a lot of work with educators, and often at this point, I am stopped in my tracks by a teacher who raises his or her hand and says, yeah, but I have 30 I'm worried about. So my answer to that is you can do this process with 30 or 130, but it's an individualized process. So do it one person at a time. So my guy's name is Sam. He's 11 years old. Write the name of your person up there. And then on the left-hand side of the resiliency chart, I want you to list the top 3 or 4 reasons that you're worried about this person. Now, usually in mental health or social work practice, we're taught to do exhaustive assessments. When I was first out of my MSW program, I was assigned to be intake coordinator, which often happens. And I remember doing page after page after page of assessment. And this is different than that. And it's for the purpose of helping us focus more for the time we have together today on the resiliency factors and a little less on the details of the adversity. So think of 3 or 4 reasons that you're worried about this person. So in the case of Sam, Sam, like me, is growing up in a family with 2 alcoholic parents. So that certainly would be on the left-hand side of the page. One reason we're concerned about Sam. And Sam is having trouble getting to school. So there's school attendance issues. And Sam is acting out. So he gets into fights. So number 3, Sam gets into fights. And number 4, if we really look underneath that anger, we'll see that there is a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, which is understandable because you all know with 2 alcoholic parents, like in my family, there often comes chaos. And in my case, child abuse. And in my case, it wasn't that there wasn't the money for food. It's just my dear parents, both of whom have passed on, just were so overcome by their own personal demons that they really couldn't take care of their children. I have great love for my parents, but they, again, were in a time when we didn't have treatment. We didn't have understanding. There weren't resources and options for them. And so my entire life until they passed, they were alcoholic and had all of the problems that go along with that. So on the left-hand side of the page, you've identified the reasons you're concerned about this person. And we've done this for Sam. He has 2 alcoholic parents and all of the chaos and difficulty that goes along with that. He's having trouble getting to school. He's getting in fights. And underneath that aggression is fear, which is often the case. So usually in our assessment, we stop here, right? And we go into a treatment plan. The resiliency research just challenges us, directs us to do more than this. We have to go to the right-hand side of the page. On the right-hand side of the page, I want you to use that same mindset that we use with looking for what's wrong. I call it the meticulous mindset. When I was doing my assessment in my early social work career, I would just dig and dig and dig and dig and dig, because I thought the more problems I could identify, the better social worker I was at that time. So I want you to put on that mindset and move over to the right-hand side of the page. On the right-hand side of the page, I want you to think about everything that's strong, that's positive, that is a pull upwards, or that is a support, or is a quality within this individual that is positive. And this time, don't limit yourselves. As many as you can think of. Again, think within the person. What are personal qualities? What are characteristics? How is it this person is navigating this challenge? Then think in the environment. Who or what or where is a safe, supportive container for this person? So let's talk about Sam. Sam, like me, has grandparents that live right down the road. I would not be here today without my grandmother. And fortunately, before she passed many years ago, I was able to tell her that. And I was able to dedicate my first book, which was called Resiliency in Schools, to my dear grandmother, who was a public school teacher for 50 years. My grandmother was the one person in my life that made the difference more than anyone. So that one person can be an extended family member, but it may not be. I've had people tell me about teachers who've taken them under their wings. I've had people tell me about their counselors, as I've already said, about their parole officers, their probation officers, about the bus driver or the school nurse or the youth minister or a neighbor. Neighbors often come up as huge resiliency builders. But Sam, like me, has grandparents that live right down the road. And those grandparents are actively involved in his life. So you want to list that? Anybody in the life of whoever you're diagramming. And Sam also loves animals. So whenever he can, he sneaks down to the animal shelter and he walks the dogs that don't have anybody. And he visits with the animals that the workers there tell him need somebody to just be there and give them some caring and some nurturing. So Sam has grandparents. He loves animals. Sam also takes care of his younger brother. Sam has an enormous amount of compassion. And I happen to have had that opportunity as well. I have brothers that are 7 years younger than me. And Sam just feels this impulse to be a caring person in the life of his brother. So he has his passion for animals. He has his grandparents. He has his brother that he takes care of. And there's a neighbor down the street, Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones has an inkling that Sam may not be doing so well. So whenever he can, he stops him, talks to him, invites him to sit on the porch, have a soda, have a talk. And as Sam has gotten a little older, he finds odd jobs for him to do. And so then Sam has a little bit of money. So what Mr. Jones has noticed is that Sam's actually a hard worker. So Sam has that quality too. He's a hard worker, he's diligent, And Sam recognizes that Mr. Jones is somebody he needs to spend more time with because he recognizes the contrast between Mr. Jones and his own parents. So Sam hightails it down there as much as he can. So that's another positive in Sam's life. And Sam is pretty mechanical. In the garage, he has a corner where he fixes bicycles. He fixes his own bike. Occasionally, he fixes somebody else's bike. And he has that sense of, I'm competent. I'm capable. I can at least do this. School is harder, but I'm good at fixing bikes. And so Sam has that inner motivation to get himself to Mr. Jones, to get out to that garage whenever he can, to take care of himself in that way. And so those are some of Sam's strengths. So I again want you to think as hard as you can in the same kind of mindset. What are strengths? What are positives? Within the environment, Sam has his grandparents, Sam has the animal shelter, Sam has Mr. Jones. Within the individual, Sam has his own compassion, caring for his younger sibling, for the animals. Sam has his insight and perceptiveness to get down to Mr. Jones as much as he can. Sam has his own ingenuity and his own self-motivation. Think through as many positives as you can. And here is why this is crucial. When somebody bounces back, it's because what's on the right-hand side of the page becomes stronger. The impact, the influence becomes stronger. Put your own name there. You have ongoing interaction with this person. Don't limit yourself. I sometimes feel like we're having to activate portions of our brain that haven't been activated for us to look at strengths. Again, there's just such a focus on the deficits, on the negatives, on the trauma. Look at the strengths. When Sam bounces back, and it could be in 2 years, it could be in 4 years, it could be in several decades. It's because what's on the right-hand side of the page gets stronger. Think of your own life for a moment. Think of something hard that you've overcome. Maybe you stopped smoking. Maybe you've lost 10 pounds. Boy, the older I get, the harder that gets. Maybe you left an abusive relationship. Maybe you left a work situation where you just felt demeaned and not respected. Think about that situation. Isn't it true that you were able to move to a healthier place because something in you got stronger? Something in you got stronger, and or there were environmental voices or opportunities, messages that got stronger. So I have a good friend who left an abusive marriage after 20 years. Wonderful woman, actually a clinician. And her husband wasn't physically violent. He was just emotionally awful, would insult her, make constant comments that demeaned her, including in front of their daughter. And yet she stayed for years. But when she finally left, she told me, the voices of the people around me saying, Bonnie, you deserve something better, just got stronger over time. And my own ability to wake up and see got stronger over time. And my own sense of self-efficacy got stronger over time. And finally, I was able to leave. So again, I want to emphasize, when people bounce back, it's because what's on the right-hand side of the page gets stronger. If we're not assessing this, if we're not looking for this, if we're not helping this grow, then we are really failing as resiliency builders, because that's the process that the research has documented. So before I move on, I want to ask you one more question. And I want to refer to a wonderful book. It's been out a few years now, but it's one of my favorite books. It's called Resilient adults. Resilient adults. Well, that's pretty easy to remember. The author is Gina O'Connell Higgins, but if you just look for the book Resilient Adults, you will find it. And it's just chock full of wonderful research findings, again, from a longitudinal perspective. Dr. Higgins looked at people who had gone through hell as children, just the worst, and yet they emerged as resilient adults. And then she identified all the things that made that happen. And I've incorporated her work into my work, into my synthesis of resiliency research. So here's a question Dr. Higgins says we all must ask. And I never got this question in my social work training. I never encountered it at all for years until I read Resilient Adults. What Dr. Higgins said we need to ask is, how is it that this person is doing as well as they are doing? So the person that you've diagrammed, how is it they do as well as they do? They could be doing worse. Sam could be doing worse. I had a community social worker in Sacramento, California years ago raise his hand at this point in my presentation and say, my boy that I've diagrammed is at rock bottom. He couldn't be doing any worse. And I said, really? I said, okay, is he alive? And the social worker said, yes, he's alive. Again, this was a social worker in a community agency, but he's living in the fields, the agricultural fields around Sacramento, California. This was a homeless boy, about 18 or so. He had no place to go. His home was the fields around Sacramento. And I said, oh my gosh, we want to get him out of the fields. How long has he been in the fields? And the community social worker said, several months. And I said, I would not last several nights in the fields. Yes, we want him out of the fields, but how is it he's surviving out there? Again, looking at the right-hand side of the page. How is it he's surviving out there? What is it within him, within his environment, that is allowing him to survive out in the fields for several months? That's what we have to diagram. So I'm asking you, how is it the person that you have diagrammed is doing as well as they're doing? Now, I once had an argument with school principals, and they said to me, you mean somebody who's getting to school 3 out of 5 days of the week? We need to document how they're doing that versus focusing on the fact that they're missing 2 days every week. I said, we don't ignore that they're missing 2 days every week, but yes, how do they get to school 3 out of 5 days? What is it on those days? What within them, what within the environment is different? And whatever it is, that needs to grow. And that's going to get them to school more often. So that's the question. How is it the person you're diagramming is doing as well as they're doing? Now, Dr. Higgins, again, the author of Resilient Adults, has indicated this is the first question we need to ask in an assessment. Now, that's very radical. The person in front of you, no matter how beaten down by life, no matter how much adversity, how is it they're doing as well as they're doing? What is it within them? What is it within their environment that is allowing them to do as well as they're doing? All right, you have your chart. Here's the next part of the process. As I've gone through hundreds of resiliency studies, I've pulled out individual qualities that the research says helps people bounce back. Individual qualities, they are individual characteristics that come up over and over and over again in these research studies as characteristics that pull people towards a healthier outcome. Now you'll notice at the top, I have indicated menu. This is not a checklist. Please do not use it as a checklist. We're so used to checklists. This is a menu. I believe every person you are seeing now as clients, as students, in your program, in your agency, has 2 or 3 or 4 of these operating in their lives. And there's a good chance that you may not have seen them, certainly not have worked to grow them. These are lifelines. These are lifelines that are keeping that person doing as well as they're doing. So, I talked about Sam. Sam had relationships with his neighbor and with the animal shelter and with his younger brother. And Sam had a sense of service. He was down at that animal shelter and also caring for his younger sibling. And Sam had some inner direction, some self-motivation, getting himself out to that garage when things got really tense in the house, working on the bicycles. And over time, that helped develop his self-worth. And Sam had some perseverance. He was keeping on. So here's the activity. Pull out that chart, the chart we just did. Look at the right-hand side of that chart and identify 2 or 3 or 4 of these that the person that you have diagrammed has in their life. Again, it's a menu. It's a menu. So you can see these even in very, very young children. Very young children. You can see them. One of my favorite resiliency researchers, Dr. Emmy Werner, talked about sitting in an airport and just watching toddlers, young children, watching the ones that would go up and try to make friends, watching the ones that had a sense of humor, watching the ones that just seemed to kind of put themselves out there more. So those would be resiliency building factors. Now, what you wouldn't see in the airport are the ones like Sam, who would go into the garage and find their own hobby and find their own way to cope with the family situation. So I want you all to identify 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these operating in the life of that person. And here's my question, and any of you can enter an answer in the chat, yes or no. Do you think the person you've diagrammed hears enough about what is right with them? This is what is right with them. This is what is working to help them do as well as they're doing. And I see all these no's coming up, which is common. In fact, and here's a question that I encourage you to ask. And I would ask this when I would work with groups of young people, middle school or high school students. Here's the question I would ask. So here's another thing you could enter in chat. As this person you've diagrammed goes through their typical day, what percentage of messages do they hear about what is wrong with them versus what is right? So anybody who wants to answer, as the person that you're thinking about goes through their typical day, what percentage of messages do they hear about what's wrong with them versus what's right? Now, I saw somebody just put up 90%. I have asked tens of thousands of people who work with children and youth this question. And the answer is always, and I'm hesitant to say always, but the answer is always 90% of the time. These young people, these kids are hearing about what's wrong with them. The resiliency research is a challenge to all of us because they're going to bounce back because of what is right. So how did I bounce back? In addition to my grandparents, I happen to have the resiliency building process of school. I didn't do well in school socially. Many, if not most, traumatized and abused children do not. But I was bright, and I was intelligent, and I was inquisitive, and I was creative. And so I got a lot of positive mirroring to me about what was right with me. And it came from school. So my first book was called Resiliency in Schools. And I also wrote an article called Schools as Havens of Resilience. And school also provided structure for me and safety for me. But mostly, while my parents were telling me how they wish they'd never had their children, and that really was a message that I got my entire life, other people, including my grandparents and educators, were giving me these wonderful, positive, protective messages that were protective factors that were mitigating the impact of the negative. So again, this negative is coming in. Awful abuse at home, terrible. I've had many counselors tell me that my parents should have had their 3 children removed from the home. And they should have. This was a long time ago. Social services has really become much more prominent and much more powerful, fortunately. There's a ways to go, but than when I was a child. So all this abuse, all this negativity, really, it was awful most of the time. And yet, every weekend, my grandmother, an 8th grade teacher, took her grandchildren every single weekend. So I went from chaos to comparable heaven. And there I got all this mirroring and all this love. And at school, I got all of this sense of there's something right about me. So we need to be those mirrors for those people that we're working with. That's the power that we have. So I'm seeing questions come in, and I'm going to take them before I finish my 90 minutes here. Again, I'm emphasizing this is not a checklist. Before I move on to looking at how to grow the power of protective factors, I want each of you to take a moment, and any of you who want to add in chat for your own self, what is your strongest individual resiliency builder? What do you use most often? What has helped you the most to bounce back? For me, I would say it has been my perceptiveness. I was just born with it. I could just assess a situation. It's also probably been my spirituality. It's powerful for some people, but others are really good at forming relationships, having a sense of humor. And I love that some of you are using words that aren't on here, and that's fine. What has been that thing that has gotten you through? I really want everybody to think about it. Self-determination, no kidding, perseverance, self-motivation, relationships. Think about it. This is the conversation that we need to have with everybody we are working with. How is it you're doing as well as you're doing? Show them this list. Do the resiliency chart with them. You could have them identify what are 2 or 3 of the most pressing challenges. I think people get overwhelmed when they see a 4-page assessment. What are the things that are most important to really work on now? Let's prioritize those and then show them this list. How is it you're doing as well as you're doing? Now, let me just share that when you start to talk about strengths with people, it will not be a typical response for somebody to look at you and say, oh, I've waited 20 years for somebody to talk to me about my strengths. No, no, no. People have so internalized their problems, their difficulties, their diagnoses. One of my colleagues who was a pioneer in the whole implementation of the resiliency model, who's now retired, her name was Bonnie Bernard, but she told a story years ago about how she was in a middle school. This was a true story. She was walking down the hall, and she heard 2 boys on the first day of school introduce themselves to one another. And one said, hi, my name's Jim. I'm high risk. And the other one said, oh, hi, I'm Pete. I'm ADHD. There's something so sad about that to me. Yes, those are useful frames within a certain part of our work. But what happens is that they become people's identity. And we need this to be their identity. We need, and this has always been my goal in working with kids, one of my favorite groups to work with is foster youth. We need the identity to be, hi, I'm Nan, I'm resilient. And yet people don't know their strengths, they don't talk about their strengths. And when you start to talk to them about their strengths, there's going to be resistance. So I'm going to share with you now what we need to do in this situation. How do you grow the power of individual protective factors? So this is in your conversations with people you're working with. Anything you can do, first of all, to provide the opportunity to use the strengths. So if I was a social worker working with Sam, maybe Sam would like to get to the animal shelter more often. Maybe Mr. Jones would take him there, this caring neighbor. As social workers, as I've already said, we're very practical. We're looking at, okay, is it just a piece of transportation? What is it? What's the link that we can put in place so that Sam or the person we're working with has more opportunity to use their strengths? Love for animals, service is a strength. Maybe your person's concerned about the environment, that's a strength. Maybe they need a mentor or they need transportation or they need some encouragement that their participation is valuable. Anything you can do to provide opportunity. And as I said, school became that for me. It won't surprise anybody here to know I was very verbal. So as I got a little older, I was in the school plays. I was on the debate team. School provided opportunity for me to use my strengths. And then we have to teach people about their strengths. And this goes against our training. We are so trained that we're somehow wasting our time if we're not just focusing on that problem every single minute of our time with that person. People need to know about their strengths. Sam needs to hear, you know what? I hear how awful it is at home. He needs to have the validation first. Then he needs to hear, I'm really impressed about the fact that when things get awful in the house, you go out to the garage. You're taking care of yourself. You're out there fixing bicycles. You're using your ingenuity. You're using your creativity. You're using your mechanical skills. That's exactly what you need to be doing. And you're also going down to the animal shelter. What a great thing to do, to get out of Dodge, so to speak, and go down there. And your love for animals is a wonderful thing. We need to teach people about their strengths. And what typically will happen, as I've already said, is they will say to us, no, no, no. I don't have any strengths. I don't have them. And we have to be tenacious. And we have to say, you know, you may not see what I see, but I see that caring heart. I see your compassion. I see your desire to be of service. I see your ingenuity out there working on those bikes. I see your relationship with Mr. Jones. And when we name them specifically, when we give specific evidence, it's hard for people to keep denying. You know, when they were just at the animal shelter yesterday, taking care of the animals, it's kind of hard for them to deny that they have that strength. So thirdly, we need to name them specifically in real world language. Real world language, not academic language. If you're working with somebody 5, it's going to be really different than if you're working with somebody 25 or 55 or 95. You can talk about strengths to a 5-year-old. You can talk about their ability to make people laugh. You can talk about their friendliness. You can talk about the fact that they are artistic and talk about their painting and drawings. Name the strengths specifically for that person. And fourth, we need to be what some of my other favorite resiliency researchers have called an alternate believing mirror. So this comes from another book, and this book is referenced at the bottom of this slide, and you will be getting all the slides. Another fabulous book, an iconic book. It's been out many years, and it still is incredibly valuable. It's called The Resilient Self: How Survivors of Troubled Families Rise Above Adversity, by 2 resiliency researchers now retired, Steve Wolin, who was a psychiatrist, and his wife, Sybil Wolin, a psychologist. And let me tell you just a bit about Steve. Steve was classically trained as a psychiatrist. He tells the story in the book. He was trained to only look for deficits, only look for diagnosis. And the name of the book is at the bottom of the slide, and you will get the slides. It's called The Resilient Self. The Resilient Self: How Survivors of Troubled Families Rise Above Adversity. And one of its authors, Steve Wolin, a psychiatrist, tells a story about designing his research to look for problems. So Steve went into his research on adults who were raised in alcoholic families. And he went into his research to look to find exactly how was addiction transferred generation to generation. His entire focus was deficit. His entire focus was negative. Steve was a pioneer, and I just really admire him because he had the eyes to see something completely outside of his worldview as a psychiatrist. What he saw in his research was all the ways that these people, now adults, as kids, had taken care of themselves, had used their strengths, had found the environmental conditions that made them feel safe, had reached out, had protected themselves. And he said he didn't believe his own research when he first was coming across these findings because he expected to see only negative. And therefore, he became a pioneer resiliency researcher. So what the Wolins found in their research was that an incredibly powerful resiliency builder were those in the lives of folks that were encountering this awful trauma, who were alternate believing mirrors. In my own life, my grandparents did not know how bad it was in our home. I think it's common that family members don't want to see, they don't want to acknowledge, maybe less common now, but certainly back then. But they showered me with love and affection and positive reinforcement for just who I was. And then, as I've already said, that happened in schools. So many places in school and activities became an alternate believing mirror for me. And then I had my own innate resiliency builders that helped me as well. So you can be an alternate believing mirror. you can be an alternate believing mirror. You need to acknowledge the pain. You don't start your sessions by saying, oh, well, forget all of that. We're just going to focus on your strengths. No. You need to acknowledge the pain, to validate the pain, to talk about how awful it is, how painful it is. But at some point in your session, you need to become an alternate believing mirror. So this is how you grow the power of individual protective factors. Now, the second thing you can do is put in environmental protective factors. There are two kinds of protective factors. We've been focusing on individual and how you grow those. And we're going to look at environmental. But before we do that, I want to quote Dr. Maston and Dr. Barnes again. Again, you will get these slides. Some of the most recent resiliency research findings indicate that protective factors are promotive factors. So that's a very academic description. What that means is that resiliency researchers are finding that the very same factors that mitigate adversity and help someone bounce back also promote healthy human development. So these environmental factors I'm about to share with you are not just for the folks that are facing awful adversity. They're promotive factors. They're for everybody. They promote healthy human development. So we don't necessarily have to have special programs. Certainly, some people need them in greater concentration, but they really are for all of us. So here's the academic quote. Resilience investigators often draw a distinction between promotive factors associated with generally better outcomes and protective factors that play a special role in the context of high adversity of risk. But some of the most widely studied factors have both effects. They have both effects. The other thing that Dr. Maston and Dr. Barnes emphasize is the consistency of findings across adversity. And I already mentioned this. So the factors I'm going to share with you are consistent across adversity. So if you're working with, again, somebody who's being sex trafficked, I just looked at that research for a training I did, or you're working with somebody that's dealing with school failure, or you're working with somebody who is living in an alcoholic abusive situation, or you're working with a teenage mother, or whatever it is, these factors that I'm going to share with you are consistent across adversity in terms of helping people bounce back. And here is the list. Environmental resiliency builders, and we want as much of this as possible in the lives of everybody we work with. Now, I'm not going to go down every single one. Some of them are self-explanatory. Some of them we would expect, but let me emphasize 2 or 3 we might not expect. So we would expect close bonds. We would expect warmth. We would expect education as being environmental protective factors, but boundaries are also environmental protective factors. People need boundaries. In my case, I lived in absolute chaos growing up. Grandma's house was safe because it wasn't chaotic, for one thing, and school had great boundaries. People need boundaries. And let me move down to this idea of required helpfulness. So a few years ago, I was speaking to a group of foster parents in Michigan. And at this point in my presentation, a man raised his hand, a foster dad, and he said, I want to tell a story, and it's really a story of magic. Magic that I found helped my foster boys more than anything else I've ever encountered. And I said, well, by all means, we want to hear about this magic. He said, my wife and I have a life mission of fostering boys. Sometimes we have as many as 11. He said, I'm a Vietnam era vet, and I would go down to the vet center and I would volunteer. He said, I came out of Vietnam better than most. And I would go to the vet center and I would volunteer. And I had this bright idea. I'm going to have my boys go to the vet center and they're going to volunteer. And he said, they groused about it and they didn't want to go. And he just said, no, it's non-negotiable. You can choose what you do with the vets that you help, but you're going to the vet center. So the foster boys, some of them read to the blind vets. Some of them did lawn work or got groceries for the disabled vets. Some of them wrote letters for the vets. They chose what they did. And this foster dad said, this one intervention was magic. Now think for a minute about foster children. Think about what the culture mirrors to them. There's no place for you. You are not welcome here. You are a problem, period. So these folks, these boys, think of the mirroring they were getting from the grateful vets. Those vets were so grateful, and they were telling the boys the positive things about them, and they were showering them with gratitude, and they were complimenting them on their ability to do whatever it was. And again, this foster dad said nothing in his years of working with foster boys had made such a difference in the lives of these boys as this required helpfulness. So anytime you can set up a situation where someone is of service to others, it can be a magical intervention because so many of our clients have gotten a message they have nothing to give. There's nothing right with them. All right, let me go down to the last two here. Well, no, let me talk about life skills for a minute. One of the things we need to assess is, depending on the person in front of us, what are the life skills that they need? So a 5-year-old needs to learn how to take turns and raise their hand and listen to others. A 17 or an 18-year-old may need to learn how to put a resume together. Somebody struggling in young adulthood may need to have relationship skills. We assess the life skills, and then we work for that person, with that person, to develop the life skills that they need at that point in their lives. Okay, my soapbox, the last two. Everybody has something to offer in this world. It is hugely resiliency building when people can be of service, or if they have a skill, if they can play an instrument, if they can bake pies, if they are an artist, provide that opportunity. Let them know and let them have the opportunity to share what is right about them. Okay, so this is a roadmap. It's in more detail, but what people have found even more useful is a model that I've developed called the resiliency wheel. The resiliency wheel is a synthesis of that list that we just looked at. The resiliency wheel has been used in every state, in many countries, in every program you can think of, as a diagram of what we need to provide in the environment to help build resiliency. So I've highlighted caring and support because that is the most powerful resiliency builder. It doesn't matter what the adversity, caring and supportive relationships, anything you can do to provide those, to strengthen those, to increase those, anything you can do. If you see an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent that's active in the life of that person, anything you can do to strengthen that relationship, or a neighbor, or anything to increase the caring and support in someone's life. Secondly, we need to communicate high expectations. Yes, I acknowledge all of your problems, but what's right with you is more powerful. That's what's going to help you bounce back. I've talked about opportunities for meaningful participation, and that kind of ties in with the next one. Anything that's pro-social can help somebody. So in Sam's case, my hypothetical 6th grader, pro-social bonding with the neighbor, pro-social bonding with the animal shelter, pro-social bonding with his grandparents, pro-social bonding with an activity, with a hobby, with a group, with an organization. I mentioned boundaries. People need boundaries. And I've talked about life skills. So you use the resiliency wheel by putting the person in that very middle, and you assess how well is this wheel in action as a web of both protection and promotion of healthy human development around this individual. How can I strengthen this? How can I strengthen this? Often individual protective factors become stronger in the matrix of an organization or a situation where there are the elements of the resiliency wheel. So I want to do another quick little chat here. Identify something on this wheel that you are doing or you're going to start doing more of as you work with your clients. What are you going to do, or what are you going to start doing more of as you work with your clients? That's going to help them by putting these conditions of resiliency into their lives. You cannot overdo caring and support. You cannot overdo it. And most of us do a pretty good job of that. What I've found as I've asked this question is meaningful participation and teaching life skills. Assess what does that person need to navigate their specific situation. So what is it you're going to do more of? What is it you're going to do more of? All right. This is the summary. 4 most important steps to fostering resiliency. I was at a middle school years ago, and counselor came up to me afterwards and she said, please help me. I love all this research, but where do I start? What do I do? And so she inspired me. This is like the step-by-step process. You start with the resiliency attitude. I hope everyone will leave here with this attitude. You matter to me. I'm not going to judge you based on your past. I believe in your capacity to overcome. What is right with you is more powerful than anything that is wrong with you. And then you work from a perspective of strengths. You use that T-chart formally and informally, and you ask, this is so important, what's on the strength side of the chart that can be used to intervene with the problems? What can be used to intervene with the problem? Teach people about their strengths, name them, share how they're being used, suggest how they can be used in the future. Create that protective web. Use the resiliency wheel. Take time, persist, don't give up. Again, another iconic resiliency researcher, Emmy Werner, who was the researcher that conducted the 40-year longitudinal Kauai study. Iconic research. Sometimes Dr. Werner is called the grandmother of resiliency. Here's one of her favorite sayings. I've heard her speak many times. Mind these 3, TTT, hear their chime, things take time. People don't just bounce back. But over time, if you follow over time, and if you see that these factors are growing in people's lives, you will be able, as these researchers have, to document the power of resiliency, the bouncing back process. So when you get the slides, you're going to get some additional tools. You're going to get my resiliency quiz. You're going to get a diagram that shows how to build resiliency in the workplace. You're going to get a chart in which there are some suggested next steps. I'm going to take 5 minutes here that I have left and look at whatever questions might have come in. So I'm going to open the chat box and thank you for all of your chats and just see.
Yeah, and Nan, I can send you a couple, and folks, please feel free to chat in any additional questions or comments, and then we'll transition over to Stefanie. But a couple that did come in during the course of your talk.
Good.
Does on the question of teens and talking about strengths, what do you do when teens have identified strengths? So maybe they are able to talk about them, but express lacking energy or motivation to use those strengths? I think it's a great question, right?
It's a great question. All right, here's what you do. Here's what you do. You find anything that has even a tiny flicker in the life of that teen or that child. I had a teacher ask me this years ago, I remember, and I said, "What's this boy interested in?" He was 13 years old. She said, "He loves dinosaurs." Good. Make everything you do about dinosaurs. Anything that you can do to bring dinosaurs into his life. So find the flicker. Is it whatever it is in that teen's life, and then start all and model all your interventions around that flicker. So that would be my short answer. What's another one, Jim?
So another one, it's a great one also. How do you address and acknowledge the cultural implications within the lens of resilience? For example, working with someone who's a refugee.
I didn't hear the after, for example.
Oh, for working with someone who's a refugee.
Okay. First of all, I want you to know that there's resilience studies on refugees. If you want to find the actual research, Google that yourself. And then again, whatever their struggle is as a refugee, acknowledge it. You know, we have our good counseling skills and they're basic foundations for a reason. And then determine on that resiliency wheel, what does that person need? Maybe they need the life skills to go down and register for whatever they need to register at the government office. Maybe they need the connection to the social service agency or the faith service or the faith-based charity that's going to help them. Maybe they need to connect with others that are also refugees in their neighborhood. Use that step by step. What do they need? So you're talking to them about their strengths. You're validating what it has taken for them to get here and just survive. You're listing the strengths from that list and from your own observation. And then you're looking at that resiliency wheel and you're saying, okay, what do they need here right now? What do they need in terms of life skills? What do they need in terms of bonding? What do they need in terms of opportunity? That's what you do. Whatever population you're working with. Again, these strategies have shown up over and over and over again across populations dealing with adversity. Yeah. So before I close, I want to say two things. First of all, I hope that you all have felt validated. You're doing a lot of this right. And you may not even have known you were doing it right. And you might have been called Pollyannish because you're focusing on strengths or whatever. So I want you to feel validated, but I also want you to feel more motivated to do whatever it is you're doing and then add to it. And I want to then use that as a segue to introduce my colleague, Stefanie Miller from Brief in Essex County, New York. I have never worked with an organization that has done as much to actually take this information and integrate it into their day-to-day practice throughout their county in education and mental health and social service and parole and probation. They are a model as far as I'm concerned. And one of the things Stefanie is going to emphasize is how do we integrate this into trauma-informed care? Trauma-informed care is great, but it also needs to focus on strengths as well as just an acknowledgement of the trauma. So I am so grateful that Stefanie could come today and share with you the amazing things they've done in Essex County. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. And thank you all for your attention this morning.
And quickly, as we welcome Stefanie, as we switch slides, just a couple of, I see folks are kind of signing off because of time, but I also want to ask again, before you leave, please complete our survey. Let us know if there are other topics or if you want more from Nan or other topics related to resiliency or any other topic that you'd like us to address. So please complete the survey as you leave. Oh, I'm sorry. I do hear that I'm sounding a little fuzzy, so I'll try to speak up. With that, I'll turn it over to Steph.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. You might be wondering, how do we implement this? How do we make it happen? Nan's work resonates with so many people when they hear it from her, and it seems so simple. Yet the more people understand it, the more we can operate at scale, the more this can be implemented. And we've been very excited in Essex County, New York, through our system of care effort to try to implement this as much as possible. Our system of care coalition in Essex County is called Building Resilience in Essex Families. So we work across our child and family serving agencies mostly, as well as community organizations and schools across our county. We're one of two rural pilots through New York State OMH System of Care project, and System of Care is funded federally through SAMHSA, as many of you may know. But the emphasis on working across agencies and being family and community driven, as well as an emphasis on cultural competence and collaboration overall, is very much compatible with this framework. So because we're working across agencies, we're able to make change at scale and convene the leaders of these agencies regularly to look at system level issues. So among our initiatives are supporting school districts, mental health systems improvement, as well as connection to the local systems of care, like referrals, infant, early childhood mental health access and caregiver support, services transitioning for transition-aged youth, as well as getting more of those youth into high fidelity wraparound services. And through our workforce development, we build our capacity within our system and focus on this resiliency framework, trauma-informed care, ACEs, SEL, cultural competency, organizational development. And we've been able to have this resiliency framework as the cornerstone of this work for consistency, because BRIEF stands for Building Resilience in Essex Families. And we really didn't want resilience to be flavor of the month. What is it? We really wanted to ground our definition and really our identity and our values in an evidence-based, consistent definition of resilience, which led us to the work of Dr. Henderson. And so as Nan mentioned, there are essentially two kinds of protective factors. So we bounce back in two ways. She described the individual internal resources, and I think of this as the cultural meme about resiliency that we see mostly in pop culture these days, which is the little plant, it's growing in the desert, it has no resources except itself. So all of those characteristics are very important: perseverance, spirituality, creativity that we draw on ourselves. Equally important, the other part of the story are the environmental factors that Nan has synthesized in the resiliency wheel. So these are the people, organizations, activities that provide us with the conditions, the soil to cultivate, to help the emergence of our own resilience. I found this is the way I imagine it, more like a forest, where it is more of an ecosystem of interdependence and community. And that's where most of us come in our work within our service that we do in our communities. So as Nan named, these internal and external protective factors are more powerful in a person's life than risks or traumas and stress. I will say that I always add that this ground that these external protective factors are rooted in must also consider structural discrimination, social determinants of health, and be intentionally working actively towards the elimination of the structural barriers of racial discrimination, health inequity, and other things that we can't just fix by trying to be more resilient. So in Essex County, we have implemented this model. It's something that seems to stick with people, and across agencies are all that's serving different individuals and families in different stages of life, trying to intentionally frame what we're doing as resiliency building. So we had this very early commitment to ground our definition of resiliency in our work and evidence-based research around the internal and external protective factors. So our system of care governance, which are mostly the leaders of these family and child serving agencies, research different models. We met with Dr. Henderson. She presented to our stakeholders. People got really excited about this synthesis framework. There are different ways probably to slice and dice the research that Dr. Henderson has synthesized. However, the resiliency frame and wheel is something that resonates with people. Some people some people naturally gravitate towards the individual resiliency builders. Kids need to, do volunteer work, and they're all true, or be more persistent. And also equally, there are those of us that gravitate towards the community level work of the environmental external factors. So there's really, it's a way to frame this work that people connect with and can remember. So it's throughout our social emotional learning, our trauma informed care work, all of our prevention work. All that work we see as adding to resiliency. So it gives it more meaning in the sense that everything we're doing is building resiliency and doing it across agencies and communities. And so sharing this vocabulary of resilience creates a mutually reinforcing situation. So some of the ways that we've actually implemented this in a practical way in Essex County is that Dr. Henderson worked with 25 folks from over 6 of our family serving agencies as well as schools. So she trained 25 instructors in a 10-hour train the trainer instructor training. So we spent a lot of time with Nan, got really familiar with the material, and we're able to pretty confidently deploy a lot of training and technical assistance around using these tools. And there are so many applications. Some of the most well-received work is around building resilient organizations. We've all been through a pandemic. We're not all the way through a pandemic, but as we all know, schools, healthcare, all of us are experiencing an ongoing trauma of our own, and the work around building just our own resiliency within our organizations and using this frame to intentionally do that has been very helpful. Apply to teams, families, ourselves. School crisis response. One of the trained individuals is a counselor who devised a crisis response to a student who died unexpectedly. She actually went through the resiliency wheel and made sure that her response covered those 6 factors. Our Department of Social Services uses this model. They're the ones that actually funded Nan to train us all. And then combine it with ACEs in their own training. I love the resiliency workbook. I highly recommend it. And there's some very practical exercises. One of my favorite things is bringing people together to do this work in groups. And we end up working on ourselves at the same time, which is pretty powerful. I have a lot of examples of ways that we have applied it, and people are pretty wild about it in general when they hear how intuitive a lot of the work is. And specifically around trauma-informed care. So, we're all of us working in this field are understandably and rightfully tasked with becoming more trauma-informed and responsive in the services that we deliver and the care that we give. So because we're already grounded in the resiliency work, it's pretty easy to see that as the providing caring and support foundation of resiliency. So we have, right now we're working with over 10 of our largest agencies that serve families and children to do assessment, training and technical assistance around trauma-informed, trauma-responsive care through a group called CCSI, and Rochester has actually been providing a lot of technical assistance for us on that. But because a trauma-informed organization creates a safe and trusting environment that includes universal approaches for all, is sensitive to the unique needs of individuals, that caring and support is the foundation of the resiliency wheel. So we're able to still within the frame make that connection. And I just want to end with saying that we're all confronted with a lot of different models, and adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, more and more emphasis on trauma and trauma-informed care. Most of us, I can speak for myself and a lot of my colleagues, when we go through those trainings, it's very overwhelming, and it's very important that we have this whole paradigm shift around trauma and understanding ACEs and the impact throughout our lives of adverse childhood experiences. And it's so hard to know where to start. So I highly recommend digging into the work of Nan, because it's very accessible. And in the workbook, actually, it says, this is an answer to high ACEs. And I do believe that. So remarkably, I do think that because of this frame and the tools, the way that they're created and delivered, we really do move from concepts into reflection and practice. Hopefully we're right there right now in this second wheel of reflecting on this and getting excited and even thinking about our own personal experiences with resiliency. And because this work crosses those lines a bit between personal development and reflection, as well as serving others, it actually takes root more, in my belief. So then we're able to actually, in Essex County, we've been able to do this at scale. So we've been able to train many staff in organizations that are also training others, and also using this model with the people they work with. And then we find that this actually has a regenerative effect, that people they get excited about it, they hear about it, they want more, and we see it showing up in so many different ways as a very practical lens to do the work, instead of getting the fatigue of, oh, now we're doing this thing, now we're doing that thing. And they're all important skills to learn, whether it's person-centered care, trauma-informed practice. There's so many, but when we can see it in the context of resiliency, I think it really helps it make stick and become alive for people. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Stefanie. So I did want to circle back. We do have time for more Q&A for both Stefanie and Nan. And Nan, I just wanted to go back to you, because I know we were trying to sort of get both in. So I don't know if there was anything left from your presentation that you wanted to circle back on. So very quickly, I mean, we do still have time left. Again, for more Q&A, or if there's anything that you want to cover in particular, Nan.
Okay, let's see here. Let me go back to some screen share, because there is something that I want to share with folks. Let's go down to the end here. Okay. So can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So part of what you'll get in the series of slides that everyone will have access to, be provided to everyone, is how to use the resiliency wheel in creating a resiliency building workplace. And this is something that came out of my first resiliency project. I worked with 42 schools in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was my first grant where we implemented resiliency over several years' time. And we worked on certainly training educators on how to do this one-on-one, but more and more people were asking, what can we do to create a resiliency building system? So one of the questions that just came in was, how can we as mental health providers be more resilient? And I did enter in the chat room the name of my book that Stefanie referred to, the Resiliency Workbook, Bounce Back Stronger, Smarter, and with Real Self-Esteem. So that is a resource. And in Essex County, they are doing resiliency workbook groups for professionals that then learn at a really deep level, not only how to do this and implement this with the people that they're working with, but also it starts to build personal resiliency. It's just filled with activities that help to build personal resiliency. But the other thing that we can all work on, and I know people in this group have different roles in your organizations, but the other thing that we can do, whatever your role is, look at this list of implementing the resiliency wheel in your organization. So what I did when I put this slide together was I looked at decades of research, but particularly the most recent research, on what are the characteristics of the best places to work. And Forbes does this, Glassdoor does this, a lot of organizations every year or so put out what are the characteristics of the best places to work in America. And it's no surprise that those characteristics fit perfectly into the resiliency wheel. Also, I note here, Gallup organization has looked at this as well. So in the best places to work in America, people feel cared for. And I have a list here of things that you can do in your organization. And they have opportunities to participate, you know, when employees have voice and choice, and when you know, your strengths are recognized at work. So again, if you're a supervisor, if you're in any kind of agency administrative role, look at this and really start to assess how can we grow these in our workplace. Cultures of innovation, employees' ideas from improvement. People are happier, they're more resilient in those kinds of organizations. And one of the things that came up in all the schools I've worked with, and again, it's probably been thousands over the years. I know that sounds like a lot. If I haven't worked in thousands of schools, I've worked with employees from thousands of schools, some of which have come to my trainings or seen me at conferences. And when I've asked them, as they looked at their organization, what is the most important thing that you need in your school? Again, almost all the answers, most of the time, clear and consistent boundaries. So this might be something you could take on in your organization. People feel safer and more resilient when there's not confusion, when their roles are defined, when employees know what is expected of them, when there's respect and fairness. And that's something that comes up both with young people and employees. If they feel that there's favoritism, if they feel that the superintendent's son gets special treatment, or you know, the director of the agency. I worked in an organization where my boss forced me literally to hire her daughter. I had a grant and I had choice over who I hired, but she took me aside and she said, "You'd better hire Anita. If you want the perks I've been giving you here," which had been trading my days off in the summer for days in the winter. It was a school district where I could go out and do this training. "You better hire Anita." So that kind of stuff, you know, it was really demoralizing, and people don't like it. High expectations. We all want to work in a place where our employees are saying, "I believe in you," and etc. You know, opinions are solicited, they're acted on, where there's pro-social bonding, and where the life skills are taught. So the fact you're here today fits in with this last one. People need life skills. They need skills to do their job well. You can't just, one of the problems in asking agencies and schools to do evaluation to get funding is you can't just ask people to do something and then not provide the mentors and the training to do it. And I've seen that as a problem in terms of, yes, we want evaluation, but nobody knows how to do it. So anyway, you can look at this, and I want all of you to look at it and think about your organization, and think about, you could do your own checklist, and you could take this back to your team. If you're a part of a team, take it back to the team, have the team evaluate. How are we doing? And believe me, the more of this you have in place, the stronger these are in your agency or in your team or whatever your work group is, the more resilient you will feel. Because again, these are not just protective factors, these are promotive factors. They promote people's health, they promote people's wellness. And since I brought up the topic of evaluation, this is something that Stefanie and I were talking about the other day when we were planning. I know that there may be interns in this group. Essex County would welcome anybody in a master's or a PhD program or a doctoral program of any kind who might want to go up there, and Stefanie would extend her arms to you and welcome you heartily, and start to do some evaluation of what they're doing. I mean, she and I kicked around ideas. You know, I have a doctorate and I did qualitative research, but there's ways also to use existing data in an organization and do quantitative research. So please reach out to Stefanie if you are interested in any way, shape, or form in going up to Essex County and evaluating their very detailed, very comprehensive implementation of resiliency throughout their county. It would be a great addition to the literature and something that she and I would heartily support. So that's one more resource that you have. And I can focus on a couple of other resources, but I wonder, Jim, are there any other questions that have come in?
Well, one just popped up, and I think you've kind of been addressing it within the work setting, but and actually, you know, this is both, I think, for you and Stefanie. What do you think communities need to do to enhance collective sense of resiliency? Yeah, like, and I think it's kind of embedded in what you and Stefanie are talking about, but collective resilience. I know there's a lot of discussion around collective trauma, obviously, and how to deal with collective trauma. What thoughts do you have about collective resilience?
So I'll start and then I'll turn it to Stefanie. In my ideal community, every stakeholder has this training, and that actually has happened in Essex County. Every stakeholder has this training and this understanding, and they understand that people do better when these 6 conditions are in place. So whatever agency it is, whatever government organization it is, whatever group it is, you know, city councils, county commissions, I would love for them to look at the resiliency wheel and say, okay, how are we providing this to our citizens? And specifically, how do we provide it to them when we have a natural disaster? I'm in the West where we have awful wildfires and people displaced, and an enormous need for resiliency just in that whole problem area. So I would just move in and just get every community group. The faith community has been very receptive to this. Every community group aware of the resiliency framework and the resiliency wheel. That would be my suggestion. What about you, Stefanie?
Yeah.
To say, along a strength-based perspective, focus on the things that are already happening that are building resiliency, that do fit, you know, that can be framed this way, build those up, and just be mindful to do more.
Great.
You know, Stefanie makes a really good point. This is really important. First of all, validate what's right. Validate what's right. So one of the things that I encountered over my years that is like the absolute worst thing a new superintendent can do in a school district is come into the first staff meeting in the summer and say, okay, I'm going to tell you all the new things we're going to do here, without at all validating what's going well. What are the things that are working? What are the processes of the creativity, the measurements of success that this person, this new boss, sees as moving in the right direction? So this is my piece of advice as you share this information. And Stefanie, I'm so glad you highlighted this. Talk about what's going right. Talk about what is already being done, and then do some assessing and planning around what can be done in addition.
Well, great. I think in the last few minutes, what I wanted to do was just switch. First, let me stop here, because I don't think we have any other questions that have come in, and you've addressed the ones that have come in. First, I just want to sort of thank you both, Nan and Stefanie, for an amazing presentation and training. Many of the folks who were commenting were also commenting on how helpful this has been in opening them up to understanding resilience. And more importantly, what you've been doing, which is so critical, is translating that understanding of resilience into practical steps. So I just wanted to sort of give my thanks. And of course, for you in the audience, thank you all for being a part of this presentation. And we hope you found it really helpful and useful in your work. Again, as we always say, please, as you leave, you will get a survey. Please complete that survey and let us know if there are any topics related to this topic or any other topic related to mental health, especially children's mental health and family and youth, and working with family and youth. And let us know if there's any other topics we can address. And of course, how helpful you found this one. Just really quickly, for as far as an upcoming event, as we talk about climate change, and you were touching on the topic, Nan, just a little while ago, we have a conversation. Oh, Scott, excuse me, I'm sorry. We have a conversation about meeting the needs of frontline workers, addressing the Great Resignation, coming up in August. And I also believe if you look at the CTAC website, we have an upcoming offering on climate anxiety. If you're interested, I know it's not up here, but if you look at the CTAC website, you'll be able to see that there's an offering coming up where we're going to be talking about climate anxiety, talking about that in this presentation. I see that there is a question that came up about CEs for this presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have CEs available for this presentation, but you can check the CTAC website to see if there are others. Again, thank you all. If you want, visit the CTAC website here to look for any of our upcoming offerings, provide any feedback, and you can send any questions or comments or feedback that you have beyond the survey to ctac.info@nyu.edu. Again, thank you all.